long, harsh shadows against the cold cement walls. Officer Mark Jensen sat in his cell, hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white. His mind was miles away, lost in thoughts of Diesel, the K-9 partner he had trained with, fought beside, and loved like family. The bond they shared had been unbreakable, a silent understanding forged through years of service. But now, the only thing that kept Mark going, the only thing that offered him even the slightest bit of solace in this hellhole, was the thought of seeing Diesel one last time. What if I never get to see him again? Mark thought, a sinking feeling creeping up his chest. He wasn't supposed to be here. Wrongfully convicted. He had done everything right that night, followed procedure, trusted his training, but somehow, the truth had been twisted. Evidence had been manipulated. And now, here he was, an innocent man trapped behind bars, losing everything he had ever worked for. Mark leaned against the cold metal bars of his cell, staring at the small window high above him. The faintest glimmer of moonlight filtered in, barely enough to see by, but it was enough for his thoughts to drift back to the day Diesel had been taken from him. Flashback, the last day together it had been a routine operation. Mark and Diesel were working a narcotics bust, a simple enough task, one they had done 1,000 times before. But things had gone wrong, terribly wrong. A suspect had drawn a weapon, and in the heat of the moment, Mark fired in self-defense. The bullet had struck the suspect in a way that could have been avoided. At least, that's how the story was twisted. What followed was chaos, a courtroom, biased eyes, and a public that couldn't bear to see the truth. Mark was charged with manslaughter. Diesel, the only witness who could have proven Mark's innocence, was taken from him as part of the fallout. They said it was for training purposes, but Mark knew the truth. It was a punishment, a reminder of how quickly everything could be ripped away. The sound of footsteps outside his cell interrupted his thoughts. He lifted his head, pushing back the wave of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. The door clanged open, and a guard stepped inside, holding a letter. "Jensen," the guard grunted, tossing the envelope onto Mark's cot. "Got a letter for you." Mark took the letter, noticing the handwriting on the front. It was from Emily Clark, his former partner, the one person who had always believed in him. She had been the only one who had never doubted his innocence, the only one who had stood by his side when everyone else had turned their backs. His heart skipped a beat as he tore open the envelope, hoping for some glimmer of hope. "Dear Mark, I'm sorry it's taken me so long to write. I've been fighting for your case, doing everything I can, but I know it feels like the world's turned its back on you. I can't imagine what it's like in there, but I promise you I'm not giving up. I won't let them erase you, not while there's still a chance. There's something I need to tell you, though. I've been speaking with some people who might be able to help, people you trust. But there's one thing I need to ask. Mark, do you still want to see Diesel? I can make that happen. I'm going to move heaven and earth to get you that one last visit, but you have to let me know if you want it. I'm doing everything I can to make it real. Stay strong. You're not alone." Emily Mark's hands trembled as he folded the letter. He could hardly believe it. Diesel. It was almost too much to hope for. To see his partner again, to feel that bond once more. It would be everything. "Yes," Mark whispered to himself, his voice barely audible in the quiet prison cell. "I need to see him." And that was when the plan started. Mark didn't know how long it would take, or how many walls Emily would have to break down to make it happen. But one thing was certain. This was his last wish, and he would fight for it. As the sound of the footsteps faded away and the prison settled back into its usual rhythm, Mark's mind raced with possibilities. Could this be his chance to finally make things right? Could Diesel's presence, his last connection to a life he'd lost, be the key to the justice he so desperately needed? With that thought in his mind, Mark leaned back on his cot and closed his eyes, a small flicker of hope lighting up the dark corners of his heart. Before the cold prison walls and the endless nights of uncertainty, Mark Jensen had been someone. He had been a man with a purpose, someone who lived to protect and serve. He had been a cop who fought not only for the law, but for the people he swore to protect. And above all, he had been a partner to Diesel, a bond that few could truly understand. Mark's story began in the suburbs of Detroit, a city that had seen its share of crime and heartache, but also one that had given Mark a strong sense of duty. He grew up in a modest home, the son of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat. His father had been absent, a shadow in the background of his life, and Mark had learned early that life wasn't about waiting for things to come to you. It was about fighting for what you wanted. After graduating, Mark was assigned to the Detroit Police Department's K-9 unit, a position he hadn't expected but had quickly come to cherish. His partner, Diesel, wasn't just a dog, he was a lifeline. Diesel was a Belgian Malinois, a breed known for their intelligence, strength, and loyalty. The first time Mark met Diesel, he knew their bond would be something special. The dog had a sharp gaze, an unflinching loyalty in his eyes that mirrored Mark's own determination. Their first year together had been a whirlwind. They had tracked down criminals, helped with drug busts, and even apprehended suspects in life-threatening situations. Diesel had saved Mark's life more than once, and Mark had returned the favor. They worked seamlessly together, communicating without words, their partnership one of trust and respect. Mark remembered one of their earliest cases like it was yesterday. They were called in to search a warehouse suspected of housing drugs. It had been late at night, and the air was thick with tension. Diesel had led them through the dark corridors, his nose twitching with each step. Then, just as Mark had given the signal to stop, Diesel had lunged forward, his instincts telling him to act. Mark had barely managed to catch up when the suspect jumped out from behind a stack of crates, gun drawn. Without thinking, Mark had pushed Diesel out of harm's way and fired a warning shot. The man had dropped the gun and surrendered, but Mark never forgot the rush of adrenaline. Diesel had looked at him then, as if saying, "I got your back. You got mine." That was the unspoken rule. No questions, no hesitation. But it wasn't just the adrenaline-fueled moments that bonded them. It was the quiet times. The long drives in the cruiser, Diesel's head resting against Mark's shoulder, his gentle breathing a steady rhythm that helped Mark unwind after a stressful day. The dog was always by his side, always watching his back, and Mark had come to depend on him more than anything else. In those early years of his career, Mark had been full of hope. He believed in the system, believed that if he worked hard, followed the rules, and did his best, things would always work out. But slowly, as time went on, he began to see the cracks in the system. He saw how corruption took root, how the very people who were supposed to uphold the law often bent it for their own gain. Mark wasn't naive. He knew the world was imperfect. He had seen it in the streets, the faces of people who had been forgotten by the system, and in the cases that slipped through the cracks. But he had always believed that he could make a difference. That belief had been what kept him going, even when things felt like they were slipping out of control. Then, there was Emily. Emily Clark had been Mark's partner for 4 years, though their relationship had been much more than just professional. She had been his best friend, his confidant, and the one person who could make him laugh even in the darkest of times. They had a camaraderie that made even the toughest cases feel manageable. They were a team, in every sense of the word. It was Emily who had pushed him to apply for the K-9 unit in the first place, suggesting Diesel as a potential partner. And when Diesel arrived, their partnership had been solidified. They became inseparable, the trio of Mark, Emily, and Diesel working together to clean up the streets, keep the peace, and fight for justice. But everything changed when the fateful night came. It had been an ordinary evening, at least, that's what Mark had thought. The call had come in as a routine narcotics bust, a simple mission. Seize the drugs, arrest the suspects, and get back to the precinct. Nothing unusual. Nothing to suggest that this would be the night that ruined everything. Emily had been driving the squad car, Diesel in the back, Mark beside her. They'd received a tip that a drug kingpin was making a deal at an old, abandoned warehouse. It was supposed to be a clean operation, but when they arrived, things went south in an instant. Shots were fired. In the chaos, Mark had made the decision to defend himself and Emily. The suspect, a man with a criminal record, had drawn a weapon, and Mark had reacted, firing his gun in self-defense. The aftermath had been a blur of red tape, confusion, and accusations. The one thing that had kept Mark grounded, the unshakable belief in his own innocence, was slowly eroded by the system that seemed determined to bring him down. Diesel's testimony, crucial in proving Mark's version of the events, had been ignored. Emily had been the only one who still believed in him, but even she couldn't stop the wheels of justice from turning in the wrong direction. And so, Mark had found himself here, alone, in a prison cell, with nothing but the memories of Diesel and the hope that somehow, against all odds, he would get his last wish to see his K9 one more time. As Mark lay on his cot that night, the reality of his situation settled in. The man he had been before, the strong, determined cop who had dedicated his life to his work, was now just a distant memory. But one thing remained clear in his heart. He would never give up. Not on Diesel, not on Emily, and certainly not on himself. Tomorrow, he would fight again. Tomorrow, they would all fight. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its steel frame silhouetted against the dimming sky. Mark Jensen had driven past it dozens of times before, never giving it much thought. Just another forgotten industrial site in Detroit, a relic from better days. But tonight, the quiet street outside the building was about to become the scene of a nightmare that would alter his life forever. It had started as a tip from a confidential informant, someone with inside knowledge of a major drug deal that was about to go down. Mark and his partner Emily had been through countless similar busts, each one a routine operation with a predictable outcome. Arrest the bad guys, seize the contraband, and head home for the night. But as they approached the warehouse, something didn't feel right. The hairs on the back of Mark's neck stood up. Diesel, usually calm and composed, was on edge. His ears were pinned back, and his eyes darted around the shadows like he sensed something Mark couldn't quite place. "Stay sharp," Emily said, her voice steady as she guided the squad car to a stop. "We don't know who we're dealing with here." Mark nodded, reaching for Diesel's harness. The Belgian Malinois was already poised, his muscles tense, ready to spring into action. Diesel had been with him long enough to know the drill, but tonight felt different. The air was thick with tension, as if the night itself held its breath. They moved quietly toward the warehouse, their steps careful, their weapons ready. Mark's eyes flicked back and forth, scanning the surroundings, while Diesel's nose twitched with every new scent. The ground was wet, and Mark could hear the distant sound of rain, but the silence inside the warehouse was suffocating. They reached the door, and Emily gestured for Mark to go first. He nodded and pushed the door open, the old hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. Inside, the warehouse was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of a few broken windows. The smell of dust and decay hung in the air, but there was something else, a heavier scent, a metallic tang that sent a chill down Mark's spine. "Clear left," Emily whispered, signaling to Mark. Mark nodded, giving Diesel the command to search. The K9 darted ahead, nose to the ground, working his way through the shadows. Mark and Emily followed closely behind, their senses heightened, ready for anything. They hadn't gone far when Diesel's ears perked up. He stopped, staring intently at a pile of crates in the corner. Mark moved toward him, hand on his weapon. That's when he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps. "Shit," Emily muttered under her breath. A figure appeared from the darkness, a man stumbling out from behind the crates, his face partially obscured by a hoodie. Before Mark could react, the man pulled a gun from beneath his jacket and aimed it at them. Diesel growled low in his throat, positioning himself between Mark and the suspect. "Drop it," Mark shouted, his voice firm. "Drop the weapon." The man hesitated for just a second, just long enough for Mark to take in the situation. He was younger, probably in his 20s, and there was fear in his eyes. Mark's training kicked in, and he saw the flash of uncertainty in the man's stance. He was ready to fire, but something wasn't right. Mark could sense it. "Don't do this," Mark said, trying to calm him. "We don't want to hurt you. Just put the gun down." But the man's eyes darted to Diesel, and something in him snapped. In one swift motion, he fired. The shot rang out in the warehouse, deafening in the still air. Diesel, with his instincts on overdrive, lunged forward, barking furiously. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Diesel's body slammed into the suspect, knocking him off balance, but not before the man fired again. This time, the bullet grazing Mark's arm. Mark staggered back in pain, but his focus was on Diesel. The dog was on top of the suspect, his jaws locked around the man's arm, keeping him pinned. Mark gritted his teeth, adrenaline flooding his veins. He raised his weapon, eyes locked on the suspect's gun, and fired a single shot, just enough to disable him, to make sure the situation was under control. The scene that followed was a blur of flashing lights and shouting. Mark had collapsed to the ground, clutching his bleeding arm while Emily cuffed the suspect. Diesel, bloodied but alive, stood by Mark's side, panting heavily. But as Mark sat there, looking down at Diesel, he knew something had gone terribly wrong. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the pain in his arm intensified. But more than that, something in the air felt off. The suspect had been too quick to draw his weapon, too quick to escalate. The whole thing had seemed staged. It wasn't until the next morning that the full gravity of the situation became clear. The news reports were already spinning the story, and what had been a routine bust was now being framed as something else entirely. The media described Mark as the officer who had recklessly shot and killed an unarmed man during a routine operation gone wrong. The facts didn't matter, only the image the media had painted. Then came the investigation. It didn't take long for the detectives to arrive at the same conclusion. Mark had shot the suspect in cold blood. Diesel's testimony, crucial in proving Mark's innocence, was dismissed. The K-9's actions were described as unreliable, and his testimony was deemed irrelevant. Mark had been left with no defense, no allies, just a ruined reputation. The trial that followed was a blur of lies and half-truths. The prosecution painted Mark as a rogue cop, a man who had lost control, who had allowed his K-9 to influence his actions. No one seemed to care about the circumstances, about the fear and confusion in the suspect's eyes, or the fact that Diesel had been the one to protect them in the first place. The worst part? No one even questioned the authenticity of the supposed evidence against him. His firearm had been misplaced, and the surveillance footage from the scene had been mysteriously corrupted. Mark was left standing in the courtroom, his life and career slipping away as the prosecutor's words rang out. By the time the gavel fell, it was too late. The jury had spoken. Mark Jensen, once a decorated police officer with a bright future, was convicted of manslaughter. Diesel was taken from him, his partner lost, and Mark's world collapsed in an instant. And that was when everything changed. As Mark sat in his prison cell, his mind replayed the trial over and over. He couldn't change what had happened, but there was one thing he could hold on to: Diesel's last actions. Diesel had saved him. Diesel had protected him. And now, it was Mark's turn to fight for the truth. The fight for justice wasn't over. And Mark Jensen wasn't about to give up. Not while there was still a chance. Mark sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the rough walls of his prison cell. His thoughts, like the flickering light bulb above him, were scattered and unsteady. The conviction, the endless days of court hearings, the media's betrayal of his character. It all seemed so distant now. But the loss of Diesel, his K-9 partner, was something that weighed on him every waking moment. The days were long and the nights even longer, but it was that one memory, that one image of Diesel's eyes staring back at him before they took him away, that kept him tethered to reality. The prison had swallowed Mark whole. The same institution that was supposed to rehabilitate and reintegrate had instead become a place where time stood still, where hope was a fragile thing you had to hold on to with all your might. And it was hard to hold on to hope when everything in his life had been stripped away. He was a cop, trained to protect, to uphold the law, but here he was, just another inmate, another statistic. But Mark had always been a fighter. He wasn't about to let the system break him. He couldn't. Not when there was so much left to lose. Not when Diesel, his partner, was still out there, living a life without him. The first few weeks in prison had been disorienting. There were constant fights, overcrowding, and an endless cacophony of sounds that never let up. But Mark had found his rhythm. He had quickly learned who to avoid, who could be trusted, and where to keep his head down. Despite everything, he kept his training with Diesel alive. Every morning, he would run through the movements in his head, tracking, searching, and using his senses the way he used to when they were out on the streets together. It wasn't the same, but it helped keep his mind sharp. But as much as he tried to maintain some semblance of control, there were always reminders that the world on the outside had moved on. News stories of other cases, updates about the department, reports of what Diesel had been doing. All of it reached him in bits and pieces. Each mention of Diesel felt like a knife twisting in his chest. The dog was still out there, but Mark had no idea where he was, who was taking care of him, or if he was even safe. Emily, his partner, his friend, was the only one still fighting for him. She was the lifeline he clung to, the one person who hadn't abandoned him. Through letters, phone calls, and the occasional visit, Emily kept him informed of everything that was happening in the outside world. And it was during one of these visits that she brought something to him that made him sit up straight and listen. "Mark," Emily said softly as she sat across from him in the prison's visitation room. "I've been talking to some people. There's a chance we can reopen your case. There's a chance we can prove you're innocent." Mark's heart skipped. He had heard those words before. The chance that everything could be fixed. But it had never felt real. Not until now. "What's different this time?" Mark asked, his voice tight. The years of being let down had made him cautious, skeptical even. Emily leaned forward, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm talking to a few legal experts. They're willing to take your case. They're going to fight for you. And Mark," her voice softened, "I'm going to get Diesel back. I swear. I'll do whatever it takes to get him to you." The words hit Mark like a wave crashing against the shore. For the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope, something more than just the fleeting comfort of memories. He could see Diesel again, his partner, his friend, but hope came with a price. To reopen the case would mean digging up the truth, the same truth that had been buried under layers of lies and manipulation. It would mean confronting the corrupt officials who had made sure Mark stayed behind bars. It would mean risking everything again. Emily had promised to help, but the journey ahead was not going to be easy. They needed new evidence, new witnesses, something that could shine a light on the lies that had led to Mark's conviction. "I'm ready," Mark said finally, his voice low but steady. "Whatever it takes. Let's bring Diesel home." The days that followed were filled with small victories and crushing setbacks. Emily worked tirelessly, talking to legal experts, contacting old colleagues who might have answers, trying to piece together the fragments of Mark's case. Each new piece of information brought them a step closer to the truth, but it also revealed just how deep the corruption ran. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became. Mark had always believed in the justice system. He had spent his career upholding the law, fighting for what was right. But now, he saw the cracks, the lies that were woven into the very fabric of the system he had once trusted. As Mark sat in his cell, working through his memories of that fateful night, he started to see the truth more clearly. The suspect had been set up. The evidence against him had been manufactured. Diesel's testimony, which could have cleared his name, had been ignored. There was no way to prove it then, no way to fight back when the cards were stacked so high against him. But now, with Emily's help, there was hope. They had a chance to uncover the truth, to bring the real criminals to justice, and maybe, just maybe, get Mark's life back. Mark knew it wouldn't be easy. Nothing in life ever was. But this time, he had something he hadn't had before. A reason to keep fighting. Diesel wasn't just his partner. He was his anchor, the one thing that kept Mark tethered to the world outside. The idea of seeing Diesel again, of holding him, of making up for all the time they'd lost, it was what pushed Mark to keep going. It was the one thing that made him believe, even in this cold, unforgiving place, that there could still be redemption. The sun was setting outside the prison walls, and Mark stood by the window, looking out into the distance. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He would fight for it. He would fight for Diesel, for his freedom, for the truth. And maybe, just maybe, he would get a second chance to live the life he had lost. It had been weeks since Emily's visit. Weeks that felt like an eternity. Every day in prison blurred together, each one dragging on longer than the last. But amidst the monotony, something had changed. Hope. Emily's promise was the spark he needed. She had told him they had a chance to get his case reopened, to expose the corruption that had sent him to prison. But Mark knew the fight wouldn't be easy. And it wasn't. Emily had kept her word. She was relentless, reaching out to former colleagues, legal experts, even private investigators. The evidence they needed was buried, and it wasn't going to be uncovered without a fight. But Emily had a fire inside her, one that burned with the same intensity that had always driven Mark. It was that fire that kept him going, even when things seemed impossible. One morning, Mark received a letter. It was from Emily, and it wasn't just any letter. This was the one he'd been waiting for. "Mark," the letter began, "I've found something. It's not much, but it's a lead we can work with. There's a witness, someone who saw the entire thing happen that night. We're meeting with them next week. This is it, Mark. The first real crack in the case. Hold on." That one letter changed everything. The next few days were a blur of anticipation. Emily's words had reignited something deep inside Mark. For the first time in years, he felt alive again. Not just physically, but mentally. His focus shifted. He began running through the night of the crime in his head over and over, analyzing every detail, every interaction, trying to piece together what had really happened. The witness Emily had found was a former employee at the warehouse. Someone who had been working late the night of the bust and had seen the entire thing unfold. The witness had never come forward before, perhaps out of fear or maybe out of indifference. But now, they were willing to talk. The meeting with the witness was set up in secret, away from prying eyes. Emily arranged for the witness to meet in a neutral location, somewhere where they wouldn't feel threatened. Mark couldn't be there himself, not with the guards watching his every move. But Emily kept him updated, writing to him regularly about every conversation, every new development. The witness's testimony was nothing short of groundbreaking. "I saw the whole thing," the witness explained, their voice low and cautious. "There was a cop who showed up, Mark Jensen. I saw him go into the warehouse. And I saw what happened afterward. It wasn't like the news said. The guy they said was the suspect. He wasn't the one who fired first. It was the other officers." Mark's heart pounded as he read the letter Emily sent him about the meeting. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The truth was finally coming to light. But with the truth came danger. The deeper Emily dug, the more she realized just how far the corruption went. The officers involved in the shooting, the ones who had manipulated the evidence, they weren't just trying to cover their tracks. They were trying to protect something bigger. Mark was just a pawn in a much larger game. Emily's next visit to Mark was different. She arrived with urgency in her step, her face grim. "I don't know how deep this goes, Mark," Emily said, sitting down across from him. "The witness is terrified. They've already been contacted by someone, warned to stay quiet. It's not just the department we're up against. This goes higher. A lot higher." Mark's stomach churned. He knew the stakes had always been high, but this was something else. There were forces at play that neither he nor Emily had expected. It wasn't just about getting his conviction overturned anymore. It was about taking down a system that had been rigged from the start. In prison, Mark's days were spent in a constant state of tension. Every new development brought him closer to the truth, but also closer to a breaking point. He knew that if the corruption was as deep as Emily suspected, they were playing a dangerous game. The more people they involved, the more risks they took. But Mark couldn't back down now. He couldn't let Diesel's sacrifice be in vain. He couldn't let the people who had betrayed him, who had betrayed the law, get away with it. "We need to find out who's pulling the strings," Mark said to Emily in their next letter. "It's not just about clearing my name anymore. We need to take them down." Emily's response was swift, and though it was filled with determination, Mark could feel the weight of the situation in her words. "I'm on it, Mark. I'll do whatever it takes. But we have to be careful. One wrong move, and we could end up in a far worse place than you are right now. We can't let them silence us." In the weeks that followed, Emily continued her investigation, delving into the police department's internal affairs, digging into records, and speaking with anyone who might know something. As she got closer to the truth, the danger escalated. Strange things began happening: anonymous threats, suspicious individuals following her, even a car accident that she narrowly escaped. But Emily never wavered. She was in this with Mark until the end. Mark spent his days writing letters, organizing his thoughts, and mentally preparing himself for the fight ahead. He knew the odds were against them, but for the first time since the night of the shooting, he felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just another inmate. He was a man on a mission. Then came the breakthrough. It wasn't just a witness anymore. Emily had uncovered a series of deleted police records, documents that proved the department had covered up the truth from the beginning. There were reports of missing evidence, altered crime scene photos, and even testimonies that had been changed or erased. The corruption ran far deeper than either of them had anticipated. Emily sent Mark a letter that made his heart race. "Mark, we've got it. The proof. This is it. We're going to take them down." For Mark, it felt like a second chance. A chance to redeem himself, to bring Diesel back, and to expose the darkness that had tarnished everything he'd worked for. But the danger was greater than ever. They were getting closer to the truth, and closer to the people who would stop at nothing to keep it hidden. The weight of what they had uncovered was enough to shake anyone. Emily's discovery wasn't just a breakthrough. It was an explosion waiting to happen. The truth about the corruption within the department was more damning than either of them had expected. Now, they were no longer just fighting for Mark's freedom. They were up against an entire system that had worked tirelessly to bury the truth, and the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. For Mark, every letter from Emily was a mixed blessing. On one hand, the hope was real. Finally, someone was listening. Finally, there was a chance to prove he wasn't just another victim of a broken system. On the other hand, the walls of his prison cell felt more confining than ever. The more progress they made, the more he realized that the people they were fighting weren't just any officers. They were embedded in the very heart of the system, untouchable. Emily's phone calls with Mark had become more urgent. They no longer talked in circles about the case. They strategized. They spoke in code, using subtle hints to avoid any chance of being overheard. The closer they got to the truth, the more Mark feared for Emily's safety. He knew the lengths the department would go to protect its secrets. "Mark, you have no idea what we're dealing with here," Emily had said in one of their late-night calls. Her voice was a mix of frustration and determination. "These guys are connected to some powerful people. If they think we're getting too close, they'll do anything to shut us down. I'm talking about high-level cover-ups, Mark. People who could bury us before we even get started." Mark had heard the fear in her voice. It wasn't the fear of losing a case. It was the fear of losing her life. As much as he wanted to protect Emily from the dangers ahead, there was nothing he could do. He was behind bars, a powerless man at the mercy of a system that had already wronged him once. The only thing he could do was stay focused and keep fighting. Through the letters, through the phone calls, through the tiny cracks they were starting to uncover in the case. But then came the first sign of real danger. It wasn't a phone call. It wasn't a letter. It was a late-night visit to the prison. Mark had just finished his last meal of the day when the guards arrived. 3 of them, walking with purpose toward his cell. He didn't know if it was a routine check or something else, until he saw the sergeant walking behind them. Sergeant Avery, the same man who had been in charge of the investigation that had led to his wrongful conviction. A cold sweat broke out across Mark's back. "Jensen, you're coming with us." Avery's voice was gruff. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Mark with disdain. Mark stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He had learned over the years to read the expressions of his captors, to anticipate their next move. And this wasn't routine. They weren't just transferring him for another pointless interrogation. They had something planned. As they led him down the cold, sterile hallway, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. This wasn't just about keeping him silent anymore. This was about shutting him down for good. The guards took him to the interrogation room. The fluorescent lights above buzzed, and the hum of the air conditioning filled the silence as they pushed him into the chair. Sergeant Avery sat across from him, his steely gaze never leaving Mark's face. "You've been stirring up trouble, Jensen," Avery said, his voice a low growl. "You think you're going to get out of here? You think you can take down the department?" Mark didn't respond. He'd seen this look before. The look of someone who thought they were untouchable. Someone who had the power to make you disappear without a second thought. But Mark wasn't intimidated. He had too much to lose now. He had Emily. He had Diesel. And he would not let them take that from him. Avery leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. You think you're the first person who tried to take us down? People disappear, Jensen. They vanish." Mark felt the air grow thicker. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't going to give Avery the satisfaction of seeing him break. Instead, he stood up slowly, pushing the chair back with a screech. "You can try to intimidate me all you want," Mark said, his voice steady, "but I'm not backing down. The truth is coming out. You can't stop it." Avery's eyes narrowed even further, but he didn't speak. Instead, he waved the guards forward, signaling the end of their conversation. They shoved Mark back into his cell, and for the rest of the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching him. Every footstep in the hallway, every creak of the doors, sent a wave of unease through him. They were getting desperate. But what really made him uneasy was the sudden silence from Emily. No letters, no phone calls, no updates. The following day, Mark received a letter from Emily, but this one was different. It was short, almost too short, and her handwriting was shaky, as though she had written it in a hurry. "Mark," the letter read, "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. They're watching me. I'm scared, Mark. I don't know what to do. I've been threatened. Please, don't do anything reckless. I'll keep fighting, but you need to stay quiet for now. Don't make any moves. Just stay safe." The last few words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. Emily had always been the one with the plan, the one with the strength. But now, she was scared. And that fear infected him, too. He had no choice but to obey, for now. They were in too deep, and every move they made could cost them everything. But Mark's resolve was unwavering. He had come too far to let fear stop him now. The storm had only just begun. The days in the prison felt longer than ever, as if time itself was mocking Mark. Every minute that passed seemed to press down on him, each moment filled with the weight of Emily's warning. Stay quiet. But it was becoming increasingly difficult. He could feel the walls closing in on both of them. The storm had indeed begun, and Mark wasn't sure how much longer he could hide from it. Every time he received a letter from Emily, his heart raced. The fear in her last note echoed in his mind. She had been threatened. That reality hit him like a sledgehammer. Emily was in danger, and there was nothing he could do to protect her. Mark's days now consisted of trying to keep his thoughts occupied, focusing on the few remaining pieces of the puzzle they had uncovered. The witness had given them a thread to pull at, but Mark knew that it wasn't enough. They needed more. They needed the damning evidence that could expose the entire network of corruption. But where could they find it? One evening, as the sun set and the fluorescent lights buzzed above his cell, Mark's thoughts were interrupted by a familiar face. It was Officer Davis, a guard who had been working at the prison for as long as Mark had been there. Davis wasn't known for being friendly, but Mark had seen him enough to know that his presence here wasn't entirely by chance. "You're needed in the warden's office," Davis said gruffly, his voice betraying no emotion. Mark's stomach dropped. The warden's office? This couldn't be good. The last time he'd been summoned there, it was for a routine meeting about his behavior. But today felt different. As Mark was escorted through the prison's maze of hallways, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was thicker than usual, and the guards' expressions seemed more tense. It wasn't just the usual prison atmosphere. It was a heightened sense of alertness, a low hum of anxiety that seemed to hang over everything. When they reached the warden's office, Mark was surprised to find a few unfamiliar faces inside, 2 men in suits, sitting across from the warden. They looked out of place here. Businessmen, perhaps? Lawyers? But what were they doing in a maximum security prison? "Ah, Jensen," the warden said as Mark entered, his voice laced with an air of forced cordiality. "We've been waiting for you. Please, have a seat." Mark didn't sit. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest. 2 strangers warily. "What's this about?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The warden's eyes flickered to the 2 men, who exchanged brief glances before one of them stood up and extended his hand toward Mark. The man was tall, with sharp features and an unsettlingly calm demeanor. "Mark Jensen," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "We've been following your case for some time now, and it's come to our attention that you've been making quite a bit of noise, especially with the help of certain individuals outside these walls." Mark didn't take the man's hand. He didn't trust him. His gut told him something was terribly wrong. "What do you want?" Mark pressed, his voice growing more guarded. The man smiled, But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had already won. "We just wanted to make sure you understand the consequences of your actions, Mr. Jensen. You've stirred up quite a bit of attention, and that attention can be dangerous." Mark's heart started to pound. His instinct told him to leave, to walk out of that office and never look back. But he stayed. He had to stay. He needed answers. The man's eyes glinted as he continued. "You've been very vocal about your case, and that's fine. But you need to understand that it's not just your life on the line anymore. You have people outside working with you, people who are digging into things they shouldn't be. You've put them in a very precarious position, and we don't like it when our business is interfered with." Mark stood silent, his mind racing. The threat was clear now. They were not just trying to silence him. They were sending a warning.